of San Antonio, league sources told ESPN. So, Woj, let's dig a little bit more into how we got here with LeBron, because it's been brewing all season between the injury, Kawhi. I think that was a Freudian slip. But the injury and how this has all played out, what's the landscape for Kawhi?
Well, listen, there's obviously tremendous interest around the league. There are very few. When you use that term franchise player, there's probably, you can count him on one hand, and he's one of those stars you can build your whole organization around. The interest around the league is built around these questions. Number one, is he healthy? Number two, we reported his focus is the Lakers, and I think what teams like Boston would evaluate and Philadelphia would evaluate is, if we put a package together for San Antonio, we tried to trade for him, can we re-sign him? These are teams, Boston's a team that doesn't have to take risks, and they would need to know that Kawhi is interested in re-signing with them, and he doesn't have a traditional agent set up here, an agent that teams have relationships with, where they can go and, based on the track record, the relationships, know where they stand. And then calling and dealing with San Antonio is not easy. The Spurs are not going to be rushed into a trade. They feel like the only deadline really facing them is the February trade deadline. And so the Spurs haven't made a lot of trades over the last significant trade they made was George Hill for Kawhi Leonard on draft night in 2011. So there are a lot of unanswered questions around the league about how this process may play out. I don't think this is going to be quick. I think it's going to take some time.
And why should it be quick? I mean, as we just saw, Kawhi Leonard is arguably one of the top 3 players in the league. The Spurs own his rights for the next year. If you're in that Spurs front office, are you moving him?
No, I'm not. I'm slow playing the process here. You've got a player who is technically on a 2-year contract, but a 1-year with a player option, $20 million. Woj is right, a top 3 talent in the NBA in the prime of his career. And if I am San Antonio, my first order of business is trying to sit down with Kawhi Leonard to see if there's a resolution to it. If there's not, then it is something that to talk about. The interesting deadline will be is that October 16th deadline. That's when the last day is when they can offer him that Supermax extension. And if it's not, if Kawhi's still on the table then, and he's still on the roster, then I could think we could probably see maybe some movement there. But right now, my priority is trying to make it work with Kawhi Leonard.
Well, which teams have the best shot at probing the Spurs for Kawhi?
Well, I think the main team right now is to focus on is Boston, based on their young players, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Terry Rozier. The hard part is how do you get the money to work when if you don't include Al Horford, Kyrie Irving, Gordon Hayward. And I think, Mike, looking at their young players with Brown and Tatum, if you're Danny Ainge, I would think you have a hard time trying to part ways with those players.
I think Jason Tatum, for sure. We saw what he did during the regular season, then in the playoffs. Just has a poise about him, his ability to score at all 3 levels. Really looks like a young superstar. I do think Jaylen Brown could potentially be a piece there. He's still 21 years old, 6'7", explosive, plays both ends. So adding him to a DeJounte Murray, Derek White, they have some young pieces that they like. Now, maybe he's not Kawhi Leonard, but he is a young piece. And then Boston's multitude of draft picks as well.
Yeah, and that's I think that would be what would really interest the Spurs if they got to that, is obviously getting potential, Jaylen Brown's a potential all-star player. I think Tatum is almost untouchable there, but it is the first-round picks. They have as many, potentially 4 first-round picks in next year's draft. Getting at those picks, and that Sacramento pick could be a very high pick in the draft. That's what would interest the Spurs if they got to the point where they were ready to move him.
Woj, you reported that Kawhi Leonard wants to be in L.A. So when we look at the Lakers, how is it possible for them to sign Kawhi Leonard and trade for Kawhi Leonard and also sign 2 Supermax players?
Well, I don't have my calculator, but I can do the math in my head, and I think the big holdup would be Luol Deng, who's owed $37 million. For it to work, they would have to find either San Antonio, which is an unlikely scenario for that Deng contract, or a third team, possibly Atlanta, Chicago, Phoenix, teams that are rebuilding, maybe even Dallas, to unload that Deng contract. With the Deng contract, we'd also have to go out Kyle Kuzma, possibly Brandon Ingram or Lonzo Ball, and that would create the room to go out and sign a LeBron James and a Paul George, and then you would have the big 3, which on paper looks great, and then rotisserie basketball looks great, but I think that's, I don't want to say unrealistic, but that will be a hard thing for the Lakers to pull off.
Well, certainly Vegas is thinking about that, because after Friday's news broke, the Lakers were down to 6-1 odds at Westgate Las Vegas Superbook to win next year's title. Now, while a guy who barely speaks is making all of this noise across the NBA, LeBron James has been surprisingly quiet across social media. Not even one cryptic subtweet, I'm saying, to give any hints about where he might be going. Of course, we've seen all the billboards and other forms of recruitment from the plethora of cities that want the best player in the league, but LeBron Watch is certainly in full effect. Decision 3.0, no doubts, will have a significant impact on the landscape of the league and on the draft on Thursday. Of course, even though we're probably in the same position that we are today, where we just won't know his decision. So, Woj, I mentioned LeBron himself has been quiet on social media, but you actually talk to real sources, not just on Twitter. What more do you know about his looming decision?
Well, I think there's a sense that he is going to take his time in July, and that this is not going to be a quick decision. I think he has more to consider this year than any of the others, and there are more moving pieces. If he wants to go somewhere, if he wants to go to a team that doesn't have the salary cap space for him, he could walk into L.A., he could walk into Philadelphia, obviously could stay in Cleveland, but if he wanted to get more creative and try to find a way to get to Houston, to get to a team like Boston, who doesn't have the salary cap space, then those teams have to start tearing apart their roster to create space or try to work a sign and trade deal with Cleveland. But free agency will largely be at a standstill until LeBron James makes his decision.
So you're saying he's going to take his time, which gives us more time for us to just, speculate. So, Bobby, I asked you which teams, make the most sense for LeBron and vice versa.
Well, I think it starts with staying in Cleveland. And I think I don't want to put pressure on GM Kobe Altman, but what can Kobe do the night of the draft, either with the 8th pick, retaining that pick, or maybe trying to package it with some other players to maybe upgrade that roster? The hard part is doing that with the uncertainty of LeBron. And I think when we look at LeBron, we circle that June 29th player option date. If he opts out of that contract, it will make it hard for teams like Houston to work out a sign and trade just based on the hard cap restrictions. But I still give Cleveland an edge based on contracts like Kyle Korver, J.R. Smith, George Hill, that have some small guaranteed money in 2019. Maybe Kobe can put those together and maybe the 8th pick and go out and try to upgrade that roster. So right now I'm leaning towards Cleveland.
So, Mike, let's talk about that 8th pick, because as we said, they're not going to know LeBron's decision. So how much are you thinking about LeBron's decision in making that pick on Thursday?
I think it's business as usual. You have to take the best player available here. They need young talent. There's going to be a multitude of options there, whether it's Michael Porter, who potentially slips, really talented 6'11" prospect, or it's a point guard. I think they could use a player in that mold. Shea Alexander, I think, is going to get looks there, the 6'6" point guard out of Kentucky. And then also Kevin Knox, the 6'9", 18-year-old forward from Kentucky. I think all those guys are going to be in the mix. But for them, they need to find young talent, and they need the best player available.
Woj, I mean, the Cavs, as far as their other pieces, he mentioned Kyle Korver. What is the outlook for them?
Well, listen, they would love to be able to package the 8th pick in Thursday's draft and Kevin Love to find a trade. I don't think that gets you back a great difference maker. I think Kevin Love's value is diminished from the day he arrived there. The league has changed around Love a little bit. And the 8th pick is not the 4th pick or the 3rd pick. And when Cleveland did the trade with Boston, they thought Brooklyn would be worse and that pick would have more value. And so at 8, it just doesn't have that marquee value to go out and get a star player. And here's what Cleveland doesn't want to do. They don't want to mortgage their future on the hope that it could convince LeBron to stay. They don't want to take on more contracts, trade out more young players. That 8th pick, if LeBron leaves, that's going to be a building block for their post-LeBron era. Listen, they didn't do it at the trade deadline, and they're not doing it now, which is to just blindly take on more money, roll the dice, and then be stuck with something they really don't want long-term because LeBron walks out the door. They have had to assume since last summer when they had a chance to get Paul George, and George would have likely committed to a short-term deal in Cleveland if LeBron did. When LeBron said, I'm not going to commit, he had a chance to play with Kyrie Irving, Paul George, and himself. When he didn't do that, Cleveland had to be prepared for the fact that he may leave.
And here's the thing. We don't know LeBron's MO. If you asked Shaq and Charles Barkley, they said LeBron shouldn't chase championships anymore. But we actually don't even know what gives him the best shot to win a championship. So, like you said, we will just have to wait and see until what he is going to do this summer. And we will. Coming up, Clippers president of basketball operations, Lawrence Frank, joins us next to discuss what he plans to do with their top 15 draft picks and what is his free agency pitch. Plus, is DeAndre Ayton a definite lock to go number 1? We'll talk to someone who really knows that answer. All that and more when On the Clock returns.
West block,